Congregational leadership can be understood as two complementary kinds of leadership. One is governance and the other is ministry. This understanding comes from a model by Hotchkiss, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how to think about the different kinds of leadership in our congregation. We often think about governance first when we think about leadership because we have bylaws that describe the different positions of governance other than the minister. And so we might have a finance committee, a personnel committee, other kinds of governance-related committees that are outlined and have positions that need to be filled. Just as important, and maybe more important, is the ministry of the congregation. And these often are more fluid and dynamic and a little bit more open source. It comes out of creativity rather than a set of bylaws. It comes out of the need of your community and your context. And so we don't want to be specific about the ministry of the congregation, but it really is the work of the congregation. So let's give a little overview about how these two complementary halves work with one another. Governance is in charge of the fiduciary concerns of the congregation. The board and its committees act in faithfulness to make sure that the congregation as an institution is adequately funded, has the space and the personnel needs that it needs to carry out its mission, that it is also living in alignment with its mission and vision. The board helps to determine what the mission and vision are with input from the congregation, and then the board helps with the oversight to make sure that the congregation is living into its mission and vision. And I talk about mission and vision in a different video than this. So the mission is actually the moral owner of the congregation, not the congregants themselves. We get into more about the details of governance and strategic leadership, so I just want to stay on the balcony view of what's going on in governance and ministry for now. So on the other end of this partnership is ministry. So ministry is usually overseen by the minister and the mission of the congregation. So how does the congregation actually live into its mission? How does it serve both its internal stakeholders as well as its external stakeholders? So this is part of the understanding of mission when it comes to ministry. What I find especially interesting and helpful for all of us as leaders is how we grow the ministry helps us to grow the congregation. The governance can pretty much stay the same people-wise as a congregation grows or is small. And so quite often small congregations have a lot more people involved with governance because there's a lot of slots to fill in order to fulfill the governance duties, financial planning, that sort of things. And then ministry suffers. But a congregation that is growing is actually finding ways to deploy its members, to connect with its members in ways to do ministry. And so the more you can grow on the ministry end of things, the more your congregation will grow. Now the thing about Hotchkiss style, what we call partnership governance, is that it is a partnership between governance and ministry, and there's an accountability structure that I talk about in a different video. But that accountability is the key. The minister or the paid staff is definitely always accountable in their reports to the board. But all of the ministries should somehow, some way be accountable to the mission. And how do we make that part of the system of the congregation? Some congregations who are smaller, let's say 150 members to maybe 300 members, where you really can't add extra paid ministry staff, actually grow their ministries through kind of a deacon or other kind of lay leader on steroids kind of system. The Central East region, where I'm one of the congregational life staff, actually has a commissioned lay ministry program. Those people actually get special training so that they can become partners in ministry. There's other ways of doing this, just attending leadership school. The Southern region has an elder program. There's other kinds of ways of helping lay leaders to really become stronger in their leadership and also respected by the congregation in their leadership. There are always members of congregations that have this kind of respectability. And so how do we be more intentional about that? So that's one piece of it, that we want lay leaders who are trusted, who have integrity, who are hopefully taking these courses or something like them in order to expand their own leadership potential. But the other piece of this is also the accountability. So, in smaller congregations, or maybe an older understanding of volunteer. We need more volunteers, that idea of volunteer development or volunteer recruitment. You're really asking people to do things maybe out of duty or out of a sense of relationship. There's different ways of inviting people into serving the church. But when you ask people to serve in order to serve the mission, you're asking them into an accountable relationship, the same accountable relationship that the board and the paid staff have toward the ministry of the congregation. So the more accountability you can have, and basically that's just saying this is what we want to do to help serve the mission of our congregation. This is how we plan to do it, and how did it go, how did it not go, to really pay attention to what went well and what didn't go so well, so that you can learn and improve the ministries going forward. When I talk about accountability, that's the kind of accountability where everyone's paying attention, counting the things that can be counted, assessing the things that can be assessed, so that the congregation can be more effective in its ministry. The more we can expand the capacity of the ministries of the congregation, that's where growth can happen. So I've talked about the governance, and I've talked about the ministry. Let's talk about the congregation, as one of my colleagues says, the congregation in meeting. So there's certain things that are decided by the congregation as a whole. The board makes certain decisions, the ministry leaders and ministry teams make certain decisions, but what kind of decisions do the congregation as a whole make? Well, they do choose a called minister. That's always done by the congregation as a whole. There's choosing a search committee to find that minister, often choosing a nominating committee, choosing a board of trustees. These are all things that the congregation does in meeting as a whole. Other functions of the congregation as a whole are being involved with discernment that helps the congregation decide what's its mission, what's its vision for the future, how they want to be in covenant with one another. These are things that the congregation as a whole wants to engage with as these documents are being created and then vote upon to show a sense of ownership of them. And then these guiding documents help the leaders, the governors, the board of trustees, and the ministers, the minister staff and ministry teams, to lead the congregation where they've already agreed where they're going to be led. So hopefully this is kind of a general overview of how governance and ministry work together in our congregations.